hers will always be the benchmark of the way things are done. There's been nobody quite like her, and it's difficult to see whether there'll be anybody ever like her.
Her key message was to be dutiful to her country and keep that tradition and keep those core values going that she wholly believed was her calling and her purpose.
I always think of the Queen in terms of that first speech she made about dedication to public service. And I think, unlike most people and most people in public life, she never changed. I mean, that's what she said she'd do. That's what she did.
When Princess Elizabeth became Queen in 1952, Britain was a very different place. During her long reign, we experienced radical social, political, and technological change. Yet through it all, Queen Elizabeth kept calm and carried on. A reassuring presence through one of the most extraordinary periods of our history. This is the story of the Queen and us. For the Queen, the 80s was a time of family joy and celebration. Her busy engagements took her from our doorstep to the farthest corners of the Commonwealth. But during the decade, her nation would change faster than ever. Through politics, economic upheaval, and war. Yet despite our troubles, the Queen remained as steadfast as always. In October 1980, the Queen made her first state visit to the Vatican to meet the Pope, John Paul II.
As she stepped from her car, there were gasps of admiration from those assembled.
In accordance with Vatican protocol, the Queen was dressed in black.
Queen Elizabeth II, Defender of the Faith, Supreme Governor of the Church of England, made her way to the private library of John Paul II, Bishop of Rome, Vicar of Christ, and leader of 750 million Roman Catholics.
It was a truly historic meeting, designed to help heal the 400-year-old rift between the two churches. And the Queen took the opportunity to talk of her hopes for his planned return visit.
We pray that Your Holiness's visit to Britain may enable us all to see more clearly those truths which both unite and divide us in a new and constructive light.
The Queen's heartfelt words to the Pope would define her own approach to the coming decade. Two months earlier, the royal family had come together to mark the Queen Mother's 80th birthday with a celebratory lunch at Clarence House. It was supposed to be a private celebration, but the crowds were so big, the gates were opened, allowing the Queen and Queen Mother to greet the many well-wishers. As popular as ever, and despite her age, the Queen Mother continued to carry out her royal duties.
Well, the cheers of the crowd tell us that Her Majesty the Queen Mother has just arrived.
At that year's Royal Variety performance, a special lineup of stars of stage and screen put on a show for the nation's favourite grandmother.
Ladies and gentlemen, may I present Mr. Larry Hagman, would you please?
Top of the bill was an American we all love to hate, J.R., the star of hit soap Dallas. Dallas was about the Ewings, a glamorous, oil-rich family in Texas. Hugely popular, the series had recently ended on a gripping cliffhanger. Who shot J.R.? Backstage, the Queen Mother got her chance to quiz him.
I won't, not even to you.
And I think Her Majesty there is saying, who did it? Obviously, Her Majesty a fan of Dallas.
Dallas had all of the ingredients that were absolutely brilliant for a British audience who just wanted to be taken out of themselves and given something that was completely outrageous to watch, that was a lot of fun.
Dallas preached that greed was good, which wasn't very British. But during the decade, that all changed. In 1980, Conservative Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher marked the end of her first year in office.
How do you react to the Russians calling you the Iron Lady?
I think it's rather a compliment, don't you? Because you've got to have a touch of steel.
The Conservatives had swept to power on a promise of far-reaching reforms. As well as taking on the unions, they'd pledged there'd be no more subsidising of struggling nationalised industries, fundamentally changing the nature of our economy. But as their new policies hit home, Mrs. Thatcher's popularity began to fall.
A lot of us felt uncomfortable. She was, very much the Iron Lady, but she had actually, brought sort of tough medicine to this country, which has resulted in a much better country since.
You do need to be pretty firm.
Margaret Thatcher did polarise opinion. People remember her either with affection or people think that she was the worst Prime Minister we ever had. And never two shall ever meet.
Britain sank into recession. Inflation was well into double figures. And as unemployment soared towards 3 million, the gap between rich and poor widened.
I was a single parent living in Rochdale, and life was tough, really tough for me at that point. But that was the situation in this country at the time.
In June 1981, the Queen celebrated her official birthday at Trooping the Colour.
Along the Mall come the 200 sleek, black, glistening horses of the Household Cavalry and the Royal Procession.
British monarchs had taken part in the ceremony for over 200 years.
Her Majesty, the Queen.
But this time, things took an unexpected turn.
Field Marshal His Royal Highness Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, Colonel of the Grenadier Guards. Hello, some little disturbance in the approach road.
6 shots, only later revealed to be blanks, were fired at her by a man in the crowd. The Queen didn't panic, but took back control of her horse and carried on as planned.
Burmese receiving a reassuring pat from Her Majesty the Queen.
One tabloid praised her pluck, bravery and bottle. And if Britain ever needed to follow her lead, then this was surely the time. That spring and summer, riots broke out in our inner cities.
One of the worst and most terrifying nights of rioting ever seen in Britain began just after 9 o'clock.
We lived in Brixton, so we were actually driving through that particular night when there was the riots. It was frightening, but there was anger. There was a lot of anger around at that time.
Some saw deprivation and poverty as the root cause of the violence. Others a breakdown in respect and traditional family values. For many of us, in this time of disturbance and upheaval, the constancy of the royal family was reassuring.
After an amazing night of celebrations, which by their size and their happiness took everybody completely by surprise.
And in July, 600,000 of us poured onto the streets of the capital for the decade's most anticipated royal event. The wedding of Prince Charles to Lady Diana Spencer.
Good morning. Good morning. How long have you been waiting here?
Since 6 o'clock last night.
The Queen passing through Fleet Street, from which she has received so much attention through the years. Now comes the procession of the bridegroom, the Prince of Wales.
Since the start of the Queen's reign, the number of us getting married had fallen. So the engagement of the heir to the throne and his young fiancée had us enthralled.
I haven't seen the ring. Maybe have a look at Charles.
Wonderful sapphire diamond.
Diana appeared to be to the entire nation a fairy tale princess. And we all, we all fell in love with her. I don't know anybody who didn't.
Charles and Diana had got engaged just 4 months earlier, and the press saw her as a breath of fresh air. That summer, royalist feelings soared. It became known as the Lady Di effect.
Lady Di, she was terribly demure and had that way of looking at you under her eyelashes, and having been the recipient of it on 1 or 2 occasions, I can tell you it was even more sort of melting in the flesh than it was on the screen.
So, approaching Admiralty Arch, the procession of the bride.
You were kind of like, I'm not going to watch it, but then you got caught up in it. You had to watch it to see the dress. It was all like, what's she going to wear,
Glass coach comes to a stop. The door opens.
The director had said to the cameraman who was outside St. Paul's, the minute she gets out of the carriage, I want a big close-up of the frock so we can all see it.
And now here she comes. Quite a job getting all those yards of silk.
My lasting memory of that day is that frock coming out being a mass of creases and the director just saying, zoom out! So that we didn't have a close-up of it.
A global TV audience of 1 billion tuned in, captivated by the regal pomp and splendour.
I pronounce that they be man and wife together, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen.
Everything about that wedding was magical. All girls are sort of caught up in the magic of that, and the what if, and how must she feel, and what would it be like to marry a prince.
And as they come to Her Majesty the Queen, they will turn. Prince of Wales will bow. Princess of Wales will curtsy.
In her bouquet, Diana carried Mountbatten roses, a touching tribute to the Queen's cousin, Lord Louis Mountbatten, who'd been killed by the IRA 2 years earlier.
Listen to this welcome. The bells of St. Paul's ring out. The whole family clustering on the steps to wave the couple off on their way back to Buckingham Palace. Princess Margaret, Princess Alice, Duchess of Gloucester.
I watched it on telly in the council flat that I was living in Stockwell. When they were coming back from St. Paul's, I got in my little Beetle and amazingly parked round the corner from Buckingham Palace and was in the crowds.
And here comes the groom and the bride again.
It was an astonishing feeling and a great sense of optimism and hope.
That's what everybody's been waiting for.
Princess Diana was incredibly popular, and she quickly became the most photographed woman in the world.
As a child, I used to dream about her and us having tea together, and Princess Diana became somebody who I desperately wanted to be my best friend.
The public were buying anything about Diana. She was young, she was good looking, The press were completely obsessed with her, and because you put her on the cover, you make a lot of money.
Traditionally, the palace and the press had a gentleman's agreement not to bother the royals too much when they were off duty. But where Diana was concerned, the deal was off.
Apparently in tears, it was clearly all too much for her.
I mean, this is the real Wild West days of the tabloid press, in which just about anything went.
I think there were constant incidents, really, in which Diana felt that what were private moments were intruded upon.
The royal couple had moved to Highgrove in Gloucestershire to begin their married life. But press photographers hounded Diana, even following her to local shops. So the Queen took the extraordinary step of summoning newspaper editors for a quiet word at the palace.
The editors were left in no doubt that the efforts of some cameramen was causing them considerable anxiety and stress.
And the Queen, this was very, very unusual for her to invite senior journalists to drinks. And there's a famous conversation in which one of the editors says to the Queen, why can't Diana send a footman to go and get sweets? Why does she have to go shopping herself? And the Queen said, that's the most pompous thing I've ever heard.
Despite the Queen's personal intervention, things didn't improve. But in the spring of 1982, Diana was knocked off the front pages.
Argentina has invaded the Falklands.
For the first time during the Queen's reign, British sovereign territory had been invaded.
Somebody out there, do something. Something, anything.
When the war broke out, I saw pictures on the newsreels of Argentinian soldiers in Port Stanley. I felt like going to the war. I mean, how dare the other people behave like this?
Although the Falkland Islands were 8,000 miles away, they'd been British for 150 years. And Mrs. Thatcher immediately staked her political future on winning them back.
When you see the Argentines invading the Falklanders, we all feel the same. We all feel they're British there. We have to regain the Falklands.
So in April, a naval task force left Portsmouth for the South Atlantic to liberate the islands. It wasn't just the Queen's armed forces heading to war. Her son, 22-year-old Prince Andrew, was serving as a helicopter pilot.
The royal family had a direct involvement. Not only was the result in the balance, but, you know, whether her son would come home was also in the balance.
Taking back the Falklands was a huge military challenge. The task force was made up of over 100 ships, transporting some 28,000 personnel.
I was in the Welsh Guards. We were up on deck, and as far as the eye could see, you could see grey ships. The British Navy, the fleet. Something we'll never see again.
My dad was captain of HMS Coventry. I can't remember being told exactly that he'd gone to war, what the Falklands was, but I just knew he was away again.
I'm not allowed to say how many planes joined the raid, but I counted them all out, and I counted them all back.
As the battle for the Falkland Islands intensified, back at home, the Queen's diplomatic skills were being put to the test.
And there, a first glimpse and a great shout from the crowd as the Pope comes out gracefully.
When the Queen had met the Pope 2 years earlier, nobody could have predicted that we'd now be at war with Argentina, a devoutly Catholic nation. To avoid a political row, the Pope did not meet the Prime Minister. But he kept his appointment with the Queen.
After lunch, a historic meeting at Buckingham Palace. Two people, symbols of their distinct and separate churches.
The Pope and Queen spoke for half an hour, and it was reported that he offered a blessing for the safe return of her son, Prince Andrew. The climax of John Paul II's visit was a mass for 80,000 at Wembley Stadium.
Let us give thanks to the Lord our God.
Just a week after the Pope departed, the Queen welcomed American President Ronald Reagan. Reagan was the first president to stay as a guest of the Queen at Windsor. And at a banquet celebrating our special relationship, she made it perfectly clear how she felt about the ongoing war.
These past weeks have been testing ones for this country, when once again we have had to stand up for the cause of freedom. The conflict in the Falkland Islands was thrust on us by naked aggression. And we are naturally proud of the way our fighting men are serving their country. But throughout the crisis, we have drawn comfort from the understanding of our position shown by the American people. Mr. President, I raise my glass to you and to Mrs. Reagan, to Anglo-American friendship.
That same day, 8,000 miles away, her armed forces were suffering their biggest single loss of the war.
The first warning came as the plane swept low over the ships, Sir Tristram and Sir Galahad.
All we heard is, aided warning green, it's red, get down, get down. Last words I heard before the ship blew up.
The Sir Galahad had been struck by an Argentine fighter plane. 48 servicemen were killed.
I was closest to the bomb to survive. My mother didn't recognize me. I said, it's me. So that's how she knew it was me. I said, it's all right, Ma'am, I'm alive. At least I'm alive. But her legs went from under her and she had to be taken away.
After several weeks of intense fighting, British troops reached Port Stanley.
We're beating them now.
And Argentina surrendered. Prince Andrew called his mother at home to give her the good news. And there was more to follow. A week later, the Queen took another call from her eldest son, Prince Charles. She was a grandmother again.
Congratulations! Does he look like you?
Hey guys.
How do you feel?
I'm obviously relieved and delighted. It's marvellous.
The next morning, the Queen got to meet her new grandson. With Prince William's birth, the royal succession had been secured for another generation.
Dozens, scores of little boats, many with bands on board.
That September, the fleet returned to a hero's welcome. Thousands of families awaited their loved ones, the Queen first among them, to see her son and her navy safely home.
The Queen, Prince Philip and Prince Andrew, looking every bit as strong as the people in the crowd.
The joy and relief were palpable. And victory secured, it was back to business as usual for the Queen and us. A few weeks later, she and Prince Philip headed to the Pacific for a months-long Commonwealth tour. One of the most memorable stops on their trip was a visit to the tiny and remote islands of Tuvalu.
Borne along on 26 stout shoulders and a flood of good humour, the Queen warmed to the welcome, smiling more broadly every step of the way.
Even in 30 years on the throne, they'd rarely received a welcome like it. That evening, the royal couple were treated to a traditional feast of local delicacies.
Each guest had a complete table, piled high with local foods. And there was a personal serving girl to keep the flies away.
The exotic menu included boiled bananas, roast bat, and blackbird stew, complete with beak and feet.
We'd like to thank you for your warm hospitality and to express our delight at having been able to visit one of the farthest flung countries of which I am Queen.
But as the Queen enjoyed the traditional customs of Tuvalu, back home, Britain was gearing up for an election.
Here's the map of the country. 346 Conservatives well through the winning post.
In 1983, the Conservatives won over 40% of the vote, giving them a huge majority. Thanks to the Falklands factor, Mrs. Thatcher's popularity had rocketed. And now she felt confident enough to take on what she called the enemy within, Britain's most powerful trade union, the National Union of Mine Workers. In March 1984, 20 pits, which the government considered uneconomic, were singled out for closure, with 20,000 job losses. In response, miners' leader Arthur Scargill urged his members out on strike.
If we remain united, not only will we never be defeated, but in the process, we'll roll back the years of Thatcherism.
That was a direct call to confrontation. When Scargill called that, it was a direct, I'm going to have a go, I'm going to bring Margaret Thatcher down. I am going to take this woman on.
We're going to win! Keep on! We can't lose!
But Scargill had called a national strike, controversially, without balloting his members. And while many miners decided to support their union by forming picket lines blocking access to pits, others chose to continue going to work.
We're just coming up to the picket line now. Yeah. How do you feel about going through it now?
Oh, no bother at all now. Yeah, I've got used to it.
With such opposing views, once traditionally close mining communities became deeply divided.
Every night the news was leading on the miners' strike. I remember it broke out into bitterness that we had never seen.
Protests became increasingly violent. At Orgreave in Yorkshire, strikers tried to block deliveries to a nearby steelworks. But thousands of police stood in their way.
The senior officer ordered in the mounted police.
We were watching these horrible, horrific news reports from the front line of the miners' strike, where people were being beaten up and baton charges and mounted police and things like that.
The television pictures of yesterday's battle have left their mark on all of us, including its reported one special and dismayed viewer, Her Majesty the Queen. Apparently, nothing has shocked her more since the riots in 1981.
The Queen had long been a symbol of national unity. But in the wake of Orgreave, her long-planned visit to the Yorkshire coalfields had to be called off. While Britain appeared to be a nation tearing itself apart, the rest of the world was coming together.
We're now just minutes away from the start of the opening ceremony of the 1984 Summer Olympics in Los Angeles.
That summer, hundreds of British athletes travelled to California to represent Britain at the Olympic Games.
LA was a glamorous Olympics. It was sunny, bright-coloured, and everybody was just so into it. You just have to look at the opening ceremony. It was Hollywood, like being in a movie set.
84 grand pianos in an opening ceremony played by Liberace lookalikes, and with Leonard Bernstein and the New York Philharmonic conducting Gershwin.
They had that bloke with the jetpack, and that was the most incredible thing I'd ever, in fact, still have ever seen. Absolutely brilliant.
Tessa Sanderson, her 6th and final throw.
With Los Angeles being 8 hours behind the UK, the BBC offered live Olympic coverage through the night.
The gold medal is hers, and that's history.
Sebastian Coe, back at his best. Here's the Olympic champion again.
But for those who couldn't stay awake, the latest technology meant we could still keep up with the action, as almost 1 in 3 households now had a video recorder.
I remember buying a VCR and sort of crawling down in front of it and trying to program it in the way you had to and everything. I had boxes full of VHSs at home, which I don't know what to do with.
So if we missed defending decathlon champion Daley Thompson, powering his way to victory live, we could watch on video at our own leisure.
Look at the way it hacks the bar this time.
Over
Hacks the bar this time.
and over again.
Hacks the bar this time. And I reckon there's a lot more to come yet.
Catch-up TV was born.
Accelerating. Oh, it's another fine jump. Yes!
I think he was, by a country mile, the most naturally talented athlete we've ever had.
When the going gets tough, the tough get going.
There's no greater honour than to be Olympic champion and be representing your country.
And soon we could all have a go at winning, just like Daley. In 1984, a British computer company put his name to that year's must-have game.
For the first month or two, I'd probably play every day. I'm really good at the pole vault in this one. I'm rubbish in real life, but on the game, I'm incredible.
1984's feel-good factor continued with news of the royal family.
Prince William trotted in with his father.
And a few hours later, his proud parents left hospital with William's new baby brother, Prince Henry Charles Albert David. Prince Harry, for short. The Queen didn't have long to admire her new grandson, as royal duties took her and Prince Philip away on a tour of Canada and North America. But their trip was interrupted by devastating news.
Early this morning, a major bomb explosion rocked the Brighton Hotel, where Mrs. Thatcher and other Conservative leaders are staying.
As ambulance, police and firefighting officers arrived, the full horror was revealed.
In October, the IRA attacked the Grand Hotel in Brighton, where the Cabinet was staying during the Conservative Party conference. The Prime Minister had been their target.
You hear about these atrocities, these bombs. You don't expect them to happen to you. But life must go on, as usual.
Thank you, Prime Minister.
Thank you.
Although the attempt on Mrs. Thatcher's life had failed, the bomb left 5 people dead. Remarkably, just hours later, the Prime Minister addressed her party conference, as planned.
2 subjects I have selected for special consideration: unemployment and the miners' strike.
Mrs. Thatcher refused to give in to the miners. And 5 months later, Arthur Scargill announced an end to their year-long strike.
Strike itself will be over on Tuesday and there'll be a disciplined vote.
The miners returned to work, but despite assurances from the government and the National Coal Board that only 20 pits were marked for closure, within 5 years, 74 pits would close.
I totally hold Thatcher and her government responsible for what they did. Their anger, it'll never leave me and never leave those communities that they were decimated by the closing of the mines.
In February 1985, the Queen was invited behind the scenes at the Times newspaper. which was celebrating its 200th anniversary.
At the Times' dignified editorial meeting, the Queen and Prince Philip eavesdropped on tonight's possible lead stories.
The next day's paper was certainly topical for the Queen. Its front page revealed government proposals to privatise one of her properties, Hampton Court. It suggested hundreds of palatial apartments could be sold off to raise revenue and cut running costs. Privatisation was very much the policy of the day.
The Telecommunications Act made it possible for the people of the United Kingdom to share in the ownership of British Telecom.
There had been widespread opposition to Mrs. Thatcher's government selling off state assets, what some would call the family silver. But applications to buy shares poured in from millions of ordinary working people.
There was a real excitement about joining in. It was like, you know, the National Lottery was on permanently, and you could get a bit of it, you know. It could be you.
These British gas shares. It couldn't be easier to do. If you see Sid, tell him, won't you?
Privatisation was actually pretty revolutionary.
Are you Sid?
Yes.
Oh, boy, have I got a message for you. Sid?
I lent every single member of our Virgin staff money so that they could go and buy shares. They all made a very good return out of British Gas, British Telecom, all these companies, even British Airways.
The biggest privatisation of all was the selling off of council houses to their occupants, often at a big discount.
If you've been a council tenant for 2 years or more, you can decide whether to turn your home into your house.
By the end of the decade, more than 1 million of us had taken up the offer, and it was no surprise TV's Del Boy wanted a piece of the action.
This is from the council. They've received my application to buy this flat and they're giving it consideration.
This flat? Why?
Well, we've been living in it since 1962. You were born in it. He was banned from it.
In the 80s, our homes became more than just a place to live. They were now financial assets.
This place holds many warm memories for me.
But why do you want to buy it?
So we can sell it.
Sell it? What for?
Bloody good profit with a bit of luck.
This is a journey into money. Loads of money.
Mrs. Thatcher's popular capitalism resulted in more of us owning shares than belonging to trade unions.
I mean, this is people making money and going on about it. I mean, it's one of the things you didn't really do in Britain. I mean, it was American, it was brash, and we're going to make lots of money, and we're going to shout about it.
But while some of us accumulated wealth like never before, others encouraged us to give it away. In July 1985, over 70,000 music fans packed into Wembley.
The greatest rock event in history, with over 50 of the world's top artists appearing.
Live Aid was the brainchild of pop star Bob Geldof, who organised a concert to raise money for the victims of a devastating famine.
I watched a BBC 6 o'clock newscast by Michael Burke.
Ethiopia is turning into the worst human disaster for a decade.
It was horrifying. And I reacted to it extremely emotionally.
It was for this phenomenal cause. I think everyone wanted to do something about it.
Charles and Diana lent their support to the event, which promised 16 hours of music, including a second concert from the USA, in return for our money. As Live Aid began, hundreds of telephone lines opened to take our donations.
Stay in and give us the money. There are people dying now.
Live Aid was so exciting. I was all about Freddie Mercury. We were at school at the time and watching it on television, and just everyone gathered in the common room and just loving it. It was like we were at the concert.
I was going towards Live Aid, driving past all these streets. The windows were open, the telly was on, and you knew everyone was watching the same programme.
I think the figures were almost every single person in the country were watching this. It was a stunning day.
We were so glued to our sets that high street shops reported their worst ever day of Saturday trading.
We didn't in that age associate pop stars with great charities. And here were they, going over the heads of governments and pioneering an effort which governments were either reluctant or couldn't do.
Live Aid was groundbreaking and redefined giving to charity as we knew it, raising over £100 million in the process. The following spring, it was the Queen's turn to take centre stage.
Umbrellas are the order of the day. The Queen has brought her own.
On the morning of the 21st of April, the royal family gathered at St George's Chapel in Windsor to celebrate her 60th birthday.
The Queen and all her children are together, and her grandchildren, walking through this congregation.
Later that day, 6,000 children gathered at Buckingham Palace, where they performed a specially composed birthday song. The Queen was visibly touched by her reception, and there was soon more for her to celebrate.
So as we can see, it is very classical wedding dress with a huge skirt, and it's made of ivory Duchess satin. She has flowers in her hair and the tiara.
That July, Prince Andrew married Sarah Ferguson at Westminster Abbey. Once again, hundreds of millions tuned in to enjoy the pageantry and spectacle.
There's something very special about royal celebrations. It is, in a way, a measure of your life and the milestones that have happened in it.
Showers of confetti from each side as they come through the rectangle of Buckingham Palace.
After their reception, the royal couple set off to begin married life as the new Duke and Duchess of York.
And there the whole royal family in the background, waving as the carriage comes out into the forecourt of Buckingham Palace.
Despite enthusiastic media coverage of the royal wedding, behind the scenes, relationships between the royal family and the press had become strained again.
This story broke that the Queen was essentially worried by Mrs Thatcher's lack of compassion.
The palace denied reports of a rift between the monarch and the Prime Minister. It was claimed that a source of the row was South Africa's apartheid regime, which forcibly oppressed the majority black population. Under increasing public pressure, many countries imposed trading restrictions or sanctions to persuade the apartheid government to reform. The Queen was said to be increasingly concerned that the sanctions issue was dividing the Commonwealth.
Mrs. Thatcher didn't think that there should be sanctions against South Africa. She phrased it in terms to suggest that they were ineffective, they were useless, they were grandstanding and would mean absolutely nothing. I could well believe that Mrs. Thatcher did not see eye to eye with the Queen.
In her Christmas speech later that year, the Queen called for greater unity in Britain and the Commonwealth.
We could all help by letting the spirit of Christmas fill our homes with love and care, and by heeding our Lord's injunction to treat others as you would like them to treat you.
I was summoned by the head of television who said, Attenborough, you're going to do the Queen's broadcast. There was this Christmas party which the Queen held for the children of people who worked in Buckingham Palace, in the stables. I thought, stables, you know, at Christmas. I know enough about Christianity to know that's quite a good idea.
Have you been to one of these parties before? Yes. Is this the first time you've been? Is it? Yes.
And the Queen was marvellous, actually.
There are many serious and threatening problems in this country and in the world. But they will never be solved until there is peace in our homes and love in our hearts.
The Queen's message of compassion was more relevant than ever.
There is now a danger that has become a threat to us all.
In 1987, the government launched a TV campaign that frightened us all.
The virus can be passed during sexual intercourse with an infected person.
AIDS had no known cure, and there was fear it could spread out of control.
It was just this very, very scary epidemic. I got lots of friends who passed away. It was a very, very frightening time.
The first AIDS cases hit the gay community particularly hard. And some newspapers dubbed AIDS the gay plague.
We saw huge overreaction. People being ostracised and banned from school, people being banned from streets, banned from society, shunned. People created hysteria.
But Princess Diana would use the relentless attention of the media to transform public opinion by meeting and spending time with AIDS patients in full view of the press.
She was kind of fearless, and she realised that you didn't have to be frightened of AIDS patients. Most gay people just thought, well, that's amazing. She's part of the royal family, and she's gone and done that.
In one simple act, she dispelled fear. And that's all it took.
So protect yourself. And read this leaflet when it arrives. If you ignore AIDS, it could be the death of you. So don't die of ignorance.
Good afternoon to you. Earlier on today, apparently a woman rang the BBC and said she heard that there was a hurricane on the way. Well, if you're watching, don't worry, there isn't.
13 die as hurricane-force winds sweep southern Britain.
On the night of the 15th of October, to the embarrassment of BBC weatherman Michael Fish, hurricane-force winds tore across Britain.
The next day, the country was in ruins. Trees had fallen down and blocked roads and railways.
Many homes were badly damaged. 15 million trees felled.
The tree fell on top of my grandmother's bedroom. She rang my mother at sort of 3 in the morning and said the phrase, "It's tremendously fascinating, but there seems to be a huge hole in my roof."
The storm had unexpected consequences in the city. Many traders and bankers couldn't get into work. So few made it in that the stock exchange had to temporarily suspend trading.
Most dealers took the opportunity to go for an early and a long lunch.
But as Britain began to clear up after the storm, the city was hit again.
Multiple shocks hit the New York Stock Exchange.
Over the weekend, confidence in the global markets had collapsed. And by Monday, the panic had spread to London, where £50 billion was wiped off our share prices.
The stock market has never had a worse day.
It became known as Black Monday. And for those who bought into the new popular capitalism, it was a bitter blow. The following January, after over 3,000 days in office, Mrs. Thatcher celebrated becoming the 20th century's longest-serving Prime Minister and defended her economic record.
When I went through that door, Britain was known for suffering from the British disease. Now we're known for having the British cure.
That same day, the Queen invited photographers to Sandringham, where her family were on holiday. It was an attempt to offer the press pictures in return for being left alone to enjoy their break in private. But little changed, and as the decade drew to a close, the appetite for royal news was as unrelenting as ever.
Mr. Gorbachev was in danger of being late for his lunch appointment with the Queen, but his police escort took him speeding westwards out of London to make up time.
In April 1989, the Queen welcomed Russian President Mikhail Gorbachev to lunch at Windsor. Since the start of the Cold War, the threat of nuclear conflict had never been far away. But according to a Mori poll, we felt far safer with Gorbachev in charge.
I think the reason Gorbachev was a hit was that he seemed like a real person. The human face of Russia, you know, and the sight of him with the Queen, it seemed, you know, the era of confrontation might be over.
Я пригласил королеву Великобритании
I have invited Her Majesty the Queen
посетить нашу страну.
to visit our country.
But just days after the Russian president returned home, Britain would be shaken by a terrible tragedy.
It's been a black day for football, and it becomes the sad duty tonight for those of us normally concerned with the lighter side of television reporting to deal with a sombre subject.
On Saturday the 15th of April, thousands of football fans had travelled to Sheffield for the FA Cup semi-final at the Hillsborough Stadium, where Liverpool were taking on Nottingham Forest. Suddenly, just after the match kicked off, a policeman ran onto the pitch to stop the game.
Well, police coming from all sides now to prevent any sort of overspill onto the pitch.
A horrifying crush had occurred at the Liverpool end of the stadium.
And the teams walk off bewildered. And it doesn't look very pleasant for the supporters.
We watched this unfolding, this nightmare. I had cousins and friends at the match, and of course, no mobile phones. So you didn't know what had happened to them.
It was just terrifying. It was just like you couldn't believe what you were seeing. They started talking about how many lives were being lost, and it just got bigger. The number got bigger and bigger.
We had the Radio City on, and they were playing You'll Never Walk Alone. They were playing the Bangles' Eternal Flame was sort of one of the hits at the time, and it's in my memory. That will always associate with that day where the numbers of the dead just kept increasing.
96 Liverpool fans died, and over 700 were injured. It was Britain's worst ever sporting disaster.
The Queen said she was shocked and saddened and offered her deepest sympathy to the bereaved and the injured.
It's just heartbreaking to watch that, you know, football fans go to watch a game of football and don't go home.
The Prince and Princess of Wales changed their schedules to visit some of the injured in hospital. And in Liverpool, the people were united in grief.
The whole city was silent, just silent. And people started going to Anfield and taking flowers. We went to this room where the families were. And it was just it was very hard.
The police and some of the press accused drunk and disorderly Liverpool supporters of causing the disaster. And given football fans' poor reputation, many believed it was true. It would take a 27-year fight by the families of the dead to clear the fans from blame and prove the police had lied.
Good afternoon. Thousands of East Berliners are still pouring across the border from east to west.
As 1989 drew to a close, there was some much-needed good news at last. On the 9th of November, reports came in that the Berlin Wall was being torn down.
People scrambled playfully up and down on the Berlin Wall itself, something they used to be shot for.
Built in 1961, the wall had divided the German capital into Communist East and Democratic West.
But already East German border guards are dismantling part of the wall at Potsdamer Platz, site of Hitler's bunker.
I was lucky to be there. There was a sense of unbelievability about it. You know, at some point somebody's going to shut this down. And this can't be real.
Berlin, East and West, united with an enthusiasm that seems to seal an end to the Cold War.
The threat of nuclear war seemed to evaporate almost overnight.
The speed of it was mind-boggling. That is the thing about when power goes. It sometimes does so at incredible speed.
Back home, the Queen acknowledged this seismic political shift at the state opening of Parliament.
And the doors open for the Queen to come out.
My Lords and members of the House of Commons, my government will continue to promote improved relations between East and West and to work for further progress on human rights. They will aim to strengthen still further the present positive relations between the United Kingdom and the Soviet Union.
But there was something different about this year's ceremony. For the first time, after the Queen left, the cameras continued broadcasting from the Commons.
Order! Order!
From now on, we could see her government in action from the comfort of our homes. Over the coming decade, the cameras would capture some extraordinary moments in our history. And for the Queen, the 90s would prove the most challenging decade of her reign so far.
Mày có ai? Tao phận quá cơ. Tao này rộng quá cơ. Tao phận quá cơ. Tao này rộng quá cơ. Tao này rộng quá cơ. Tao này rộng quá cơ. Rộng quá cơ. Mày có ai?
Đừng bao giờ dạy con rằng là đi ra ngoài nhớ mắt vào đầu đánh chết rất ngu. Đó, nó có chú đó, nó có bác nó. Bác nó cầm súng đấy, nó bắn cái phẳng bắn chết bác. Nó có thể ngu. Nó có thể ngu. Bắn cái phẳng. Em có thể nói ngu. Nó có chú, nó có bác nó. Em có thể nói ngu. Nó có chú, nó có bác nó. Bắn cái phẳng. Em có thể nói ngu. Bắn cái phẳng. Bắn cái phẳng.
Mày có ai? Tao phận quá cơ. Tao này rộng quá cơ. Tao phận quá cơ. Tao này rộng quá cơ. Tao này rộng quá cơ. Tao này rộng quá cơ. Rộng quá cơ. Mày có ai? Tao phận quá cơ. Tao này rộng quá cơ. Tao phận quá cơ. Tao này rộng quá cơ. Tao này rộng quá cơ. Tao này rộng quá cơ.
Open for the Queen to come out.
My Lords and members of the House of Commons, my government will continue to promote improved relations between East and West and to work for further progress on human rights. They will aim to strengthen still further the present positive relations between the United Kingdom
and the Soviet Union.
But there was something different about this year's ceremony. For the first time, after the Queen left, the cameras continued broadcasting from the Commons.
Order! Order!
From now on, we could see her government in action from the comfort of our homes. Over the coming decade, the cameras would capture some extraordinary moments in our history. And for the Queen, the 90s would prove the most challenging decade of her reign so far.